Hello and welcome to another How to Code Well web chat. My name's Peter Fisher, and in today's episode I would like to discuss in my opinion, the top 5 things that every web developer and every web development team should be striving for in 2017. These are technical requirements that I personally feel should be on every roadmap for every web development team across the board. And these items will slowly become the de facto standard of web development. And so if you don't have these in your projects, or if you're not considering to moving into these in your projects, then you will be left behind. And some of these will have tremendous impacts to things like search traffic and stuff like that. So anyway, let's get into it. So the first thing, in my opinion, is HTTPS and SSL. Now, the reason being is that browsers now will start displaying insecure websites and notifying people that their websites are insecure, which is a great thing in my opinion. It just means though that when someone's logging into, say they're putting in their login details, the browser will display to the user of using that website that it's an insecure form that they're filling out. The traffic will be unencrypted, and so that it has a negative impact to the user experience. That's one thing. The other reason why I think that HTTPS should be used, should be employed on websites now, is that search ranking is affected or is becoming more affected by HTTPS. So, for instance, if you've got a really good website which has lots and lots of traffic and lots of traction, and it's really high up in the search rankings, and you've spent years and years, developing keywords and descriptions and making it nice and organic for search engine optimization. If you skimp on HTTPS, if you don't bother putting HTTPS, you will start to find that your ranking in the searches will start to come down, and that's because Google is prioritizing, and not just Google but other search engines as well. They are starting to prioritize websites that have HTTPS over websites that don't have HTTPS. So adding HTTPS technically to your website isn't actually a big deal technically. It's a case of getting a certificate from a verified source, and then adjusting the host entries in your server, or IIS if it's Windows, or Apache or Nginx for Linux maybe. So adjusting those to run the website through a different port, and you need to configure where the certificates live on the server. So in the technical sense, it's not a massive thing to do. However, it does have huge impacts to SEO. So if anyone says to you, look, doing SSL is a breeze, it's a piece of cake, you can do it within 5 minutes. Okay, that might be technically sound-ish. You obviously need to purchase the SSL certificate, and that can take a bit of time. It can take a couple of days to provision and so forth. So I wouldn't say it would be a 5-minute job. It needs to be planned for. But the thing is, it has a huge, wide-reaching impact to your current traffic, because essentially what you're doing is you're setting up a separate website, and you should be thinking about, your mindset when doing SSL should be a website migration, because essentially that's what you're doing. And so the search engines will be seeing that as a separate website, HTTPS compared to HTTP. And so currently you've got all your traffic in HTTP, and you want to move that over to HTTPS. You want to ensure that if someone goes to your website as HTTP, it gets pushed and forced into HTTPS. So you need to do ideally what you should be doing is monitoring the traffic before and after, and writing yourself a checklist of all the things that will be impacted by this SSL migration. for instance, just off the top of my head, social media, right? So you got to ensure that all your social media links now use HTTPS, making sure all your newsletters use HTTPS and so forth. And also, if it's not just a website, if it's a service, say if it's an API, or say if it's for an RSS feed or for an app, for instance, then you have to make sure that the additional outside satellite systems that connect to your website has also been adjusted. So that might mean having to, if you've got a hard-coded link in an app, then it might mean that you need to roll out another version of an app, with that adjustment. So if anyone says to you it's a 5-minute fix, it's not. Okay, it has a massive implication to other things, and the more complicated your setup is, the not complicated, the more vast your setup is, the more it will impact. So it's a project in itself, but I would hope that web development teams are having a discussion about how best to migrate their stuff to HTTPS in the future. Also, HTTP2 is coming out as well, and that requires HTTPS, I believe. So it's future-proofing yourself. Okay, so anyway, that's that out of the way. The second one is a bugbear of mine, and that is unit testing. If you don't unit test your code, you do not know for 100%. Well, you won't know for 100%, but you won't be reassured that the stuff that you're throwing over the fence works. And it's a bugbear for me because I'm a freelancer, and whenever I go to clients' projects and perhaps they want to take on another developer, or perhaps a developer has left, one of the first questions I asked is, can I run your unit tests, please? I want to ensure that the code that I'm writing on your system has not broken anything existing in your system. And 9 times out of 10, there isn't any, which is, or it's not good enough code coverage. And so the discussion turns into getting the right required unit tests to make, so developers feel comfortable that what they're doing is correct, and doesn't impact other bits and pieces. Now, unit testing, I know, takes a bit of time, certainly takes a long time, especially if you've got an existing system and you're trying to write tests against the existing website. It can be like walking through treacle. It's quite laborious. But you can look, if you've got an existing system and you're doing that, then one of the things that you could possibly do as a quick win is to just do some very high level functional tests. As in, let's just crawl the web pages and ensure that they all return a 200 OK HTTP response. Just having that sort of sense checking that the code that I'm writing, or the code that the developers are writing, hasn't had any negative impacts to the existing system. So yeah, unit test. Try and get your code coverage up. It's very difficult to get over 100%, and if you are to get 100%, and in my personal opinion, people shouldn't be striving for 100%. Not all the time anyway. And even if you get to 100%, it's not going to be a signed, sealed guarantee that your code is bulletproof. Because if you were to look at let's just say a form, right? So an input form with a bunch of fields, and you need to validate that against a couple of, you need to ensure that the stuff coming in from the user is in a correct format. Well, it's a completely open text, so anybody could put any kind of stuff into that thing. And if you're just validating that the string matches a certain pattern, well, what happens if the string comes in as a different pattern? So There's lots of, basically what I'm saying is there's lots of entry points into your system, and then you have to ensure that those get tested too. So even if you get 100, even if you test an input form and everything's green and everything's fine and everything, code coverage is hunky-dory, it does not mean that people will still be able to put some rubbish into that form and break it down the line, especially if you're if you're the code that accepts and deals with that response assumes that certain patterns of that input are in a certain format, and it's where your code makes assumptions, and it's that which causes headaches and breaks and stuff like that. So, for instance, you could have your input form could have 5 or 6 or 10 or 20 or a huge amount of unit tests just against that single form, just against that single input, perhaps. And just doing it once will obviously give you a green light and okay, but that does not mean that form is 100% bulletproof. But I digress. One unit test is far better than no unit tests, in my opinion. And like I said, the simplest unit test, if you don't have any unit tests yet and you're working through an existing system, is to just do a high level functional test, crawl your pages, crawl get request, get pages on using a get request, and just ensure that the response comes back as a 200 OK. Just do that across the whole board. If you've got a flat website, for example, and it's not really that dynamic, just do that. Just run a crawler across it, just to ensure that everything is working as you would assume it should work. Okay, and then you can start getting into the nitty-gritty side of things. So the next thing, number 3, is uglification and minification, and I'm an offender of this. A lot of my stuff, personal stuff at least, is not minified and uglified. I'm going to be working towards doing that in the coming year or so, and that basically is a way of reducing the amount of legwork that a browser has to do. So, for instance, I mean, there are crazy projects out there with say 30 or 40 different external CSS files and JavaScript files, and that's making 30 or 40 requests to the browser, to your server to pull down that code, and by uglifying it, what you're doing is you're stripping out the comments, and you're compressing the code down into, say, single lines, and you're also you're bunching up the external files into one. So where you've got, say, 30 external JavaScript files, and for God's sake, I hope you don't, maybe the odd 5 perhaps, by putting that into a single file and reducing all of that, compressing all that code, you're reducing the number of HTTP requests from 5, or if it is as bad as 30, to 1, and therefore it only has to do one trip. Yes, the trip is a far larger trip than just a single HTTP request of the 30, but because it's only doing one, you can then cache it. You can do some clever things with caching and so forth. And it just speeds up the client performance of your application, of your website, which is a great win. Now the unit testing and the minification stuff, that kind of moves on to the next point that I want to make, which is the 4th point, which is auto deployments. Auto deployments is a way of continually integrating your work into say a staging server, and then maybe even, if you're brave enough, to putting it into production. And in doing so, you're taking all the worry and the legwork off of the developers, because when you're deploying code, it's actually quite a scary time to deploy code, especially if you're using a waterfall process, which I hope you're not. But if you are, and it's a big bang release, it's quite a scary time to just push the code up. Now, when you're doing auto deployments, it is as simple as pressing a button somewhere on some interface or running a script against some server, and then it runs through a bunch of jobs, processing jobs, and then pushes that code across. Perhaps it's doing some automated things for, say, your source control tagging. Perhaps it's doing some unit testing that I mentioned before. Perhaps it's uglifying and minifying the code automatically for you. There are lots and lots of things that you can do, or use tools that you can utilize that will allow you to do this. For instance, there's less. There's an npm module for less that you can do to minify your stuff. There's PHP unit if you're a PHP dev for unit testing, or there's PHP spec and so forth, and bhat and all of those things. And if you really want to get proper serious about auto deployments, then you really should be having some sort of builder to do this. And my recommendation is Jenkins, because Jenkins is a great, in my opinion, a great open source tool. It's completely free, open source tool that you can build pipelines. So one of your builds could be to test your code. Next one could be to document your code, so automatic documentation. So running things like PHP docs. And then running things like check styles, running things like pdepend or PMD, to make sure that your code, it fits some form of standard, and that you have some reassurance that the code that you've committed to that branch is at a good standard. Now, you don't have to go that far. It could just be as simple as a bash script, or it could be Capistrano, for instance, that you do. You might have an SSH jump box that you SSH into and then run a script, and then that pulls in all the bits and pieces, runs all the tests, then deploys it to a staging server or a production server, and then does CDN bits and pieces for your assets, and then clears the caching and so forth. That is completely tailored to what you need. But the alternative, you see, to auto deploying is deploying manually, and it's not fun. It's not fun. It takes a lot of manpower to do that. There's a lot of it's prone to human error, just in case something falls over. Auto deploying means that you can deploy things quite rapidly, again and again and again and again. If I was to tell you that I can deploy a piece of code 40 times a day, quite happily, and know that know that all the unit tests are passing and so forth, then yeah, I mean that's a reality. That is a reality, and you can put some build triggers in. So, for example, if the PHP unit tests fail, you don't continue deploying the code. Obviously, and then you can say you can automate your responses. So, for instance, once the build goes live, you can then do like a tag, or perhaps you can do an artifact to capture what you've put live, a snapshot, if you will, and then you could do some automatic emails to the team, just saying this build number has now been released, and so forth. So. The final one, the fifth one that I think that web development teams should be considering at least, is Docker, or just containerization. So containing your applications and moving out of the sort of like it's all living on the host type scenario, because I'm a big advocate of Docker. I love Docker. It's just changed my whole working environment, my whole every day-to-day working of web development. I can run the same stuff that I've got on staging and production on my local environment. I can have various projects that have different configuration that are isolated, and are they don't conflict each other. Different versions of PHP, different versions of other libraries and so forth don't get intermingled because I'm working on multiple things at the same time. It just really makes you think about how the services that you're creating are structured. And I guess that goes into the auto deployments, because you can spin up or run your Docker containers in your different environments, and you can inject the different config through Docker Compose and other bits and pieces like that. So, I've got a lot of Docker tutorials that I will be putting in a link in the description. I've also mentioned my opinion of why I think FTP is a bad smell for deploying code. So I'll put that in the link in the description thing as well. But they're my top 5. So HTTPS, unit testing, uglification and minification, auto deployments, and finally Docker. I think these 5 things are crucial for going forward in web development, and I personally think that especially HTTPS should be a critical thing for web development teams to be investigating and looking into. And just on that point, with HTTPS, there are various services that you can use. So, for instance, you could use the Let's Encrypt service that can encrypt your stuff for free. It's a free service. It's pretty good. But if you're working on, I would recommend that for, say, personal projects or portfolios and things like that. Very small sites, maybe microsites perhaps. If you're working on something that is a little bit more robust, a little bit more heavyweight, perhaps has to deal with requests from other things, perhaps it's handling sensitive data, then there are other verified sources that you can get. And if you've got lots of subdomains, then there's other things that you can do. You can have wildcards and so forth. So that is a big project. Do investigate what is needed for your team. Unit test your work, for God's sake, because it just makes your life so much easier. It just it's almost like you're having another developer watching you code and saying, you've just gone and broken something. That is, it's so good to have unit testing. Uglify and minify your work, because you'll reduce the amount of overhead that the browser has to do. Look at auto deployment. Auto deployment, once set up and once the team has bought into the fact that deploying code automatically is the future, then it just makes your life so much easier, and it makes the deployment less scary. Because if you're deploying something, say, 5 times a day, that's you want to ensure that it works, yeah. But if you're not deploying it until right at the end of your project, then you don't know whether the deployment itself works, right? Whereas if you're deploying it 5 times a day, you can ensure that the actual deployment process works. It might not have worked on the first time, but it certainly works on the 5th time. Whereas if you leave it right to the end, you don't have that knowledge of whether the deployment process itself works. And finally, consider using Docker to isolate your services, your applications into processes, and use things like volumes to manage your data. Bring that into, say, your backups as well. So you can have some scripts that run backups against your volumes, and it certainly is a very good for working on different environments where you have different configurations and so forth, and it just ensures that everyone is working on the same, singing from the same hymn sheet, that everybody is running the same Docker images as what's on your staging server, what's on your production server. Obviously there'll be configuration changes, but the core fundamentals of, say, the version of the language that you're using, or the version of the libraries that you're using, are consistent across the board. That reduces the headaches and the chances that someone says, oh, well, it works on my machine. Well, your machine is exactly the same as everyone else's machine, because it's the container. But anyway, so they're my top 5. I do hope that web development teams and web developers will consider these in 2017. I think these are very important to move forward. I would like to be in a position next year, say 2018, where there'll be more HTTPS than HTTP websites. I would like to know that everyone is unit testing their code far more. And auto deployments. I mean, I would love everyone to be deploying their code automatically and have automatically generated things from off of the back of that. So yeah, I'm gonna leave it there. But if you've got any comments, maybe you would think that another thing should be in here or replace one of these items on this list, then do put them in the comment section below. Like the video if you found it helpful, share it around if you think others will do so too. Subscribe to pick up the next web chats and tutorials. So I'm still doing Docker, that's going on till the end of February, and then we're doing something slightly different after February. So do subscribe to get those. Thanks again for watching, and I shall see you again soon. Cheers, bye.